The Cold War did not begin with a declaration. There was no formal ceremony, no signed agreement, no official acknowledgement that the world had entered a new kind of conflict. It arrived the way radiation does, invisibly, through walls, through bureaucracies, through the ordinary routines of men who had been given extraordinary authority over things that had never existed before. And when people say it ended peacefully, they are relying on a definition of peace that excludes most of what actually happened during those 4 decades. Peace, in the accepted version of events, means no nuclear weapon was ever detonated in anger between the 2 superpowers. That part is accurate. What that version leaves out is everything else. The close calls that were never publicly acknowledged, the systems that were activated and then quietly stood down, the accidents that were classified before anyone outside a small circle of officials could learn what nearly happened. The machines that were given conditional authority to end civilization and were never fully rescinded of that authority. The Cold War was not mostly peaceful. It was mostly secret. What follows is an account of 21 programs, projects, and operational realities from that era. Some of them were acknowledged by the governments that created them, eventually years or decades after the fact, often in heavily redacted form. Others became known through defectors, through the slow decay of classification schedules, through historians who filed enough requests and waited long enough that the machinery of official secrecy finally produced something legible. A few remain officially denied, their existence confirmed only through the convergence of independent sources, the testimonies of people who had nothing left to lose, and documents that survived shredding schedules by accident or bureaucratic oversight. None of them were science fiction. All of them functioned, or were intended to function, in the real world, against real targets, with real consequences that were never required to materialize because circumstances, mechanical failure, a single officer's hesitation, or simple chance intervened at the necessary moment. The first of these programs was not a weapon, it was a tunnel. In the early 1950s, American and British intelligence services conceived an operation that would require excavating a shaft approximately 15 meters deep and roughly 500 meters long under the divided city of Berlin, terminating directly beneath a cluster of Soviet military communication cables. The operation was given the name Gold by the Americans and Label by the British. The planning was meticulous. Engineers conducted soil surveys. Mock-up sections of tunnel were constructed in the United States to test excavation techniques. A warehouse was built in the American sector of Berlin to serve as the surface cover operation, ostensibly storing military supplies. The tunnel itself was refrigerated to prevent soil temperature changes from creating visible frost patterns on the surface above. The project took nearly a year to complete. Once the tap was operational, it began producing an extraordinary volume of intercepted communications, telephone calls, teletype messages, and data transmissions flowing between Moscow and Soviet military headquarters in East Germany. The material was processed around the clock. Analysts worked in shifts. The intelligence product was considered among the most valuable generated by either Western service during that period. What neither the Americans nor the British knew was that the Soviets had been fully informed of the tunnel's existence before the first shovel broke ground. George Blake, a senior British intelligence officer who had been involved in the operations planning, had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while a prisoner during the Korean War. He reported the tunnel project to his handlers before construction began. The Soviets faced a decision. If they immediately disabled the tap or arrested those operating it, they would expose Blake, whose access to British operations was considered far more valuable than any intelligence being lost through the tunnel. So they did nothing. They allowed the tunnel to operate for 11 months, carefully managing what information passed through the compromised cables to ensure nothing of genuine operational value was intercepted, while feeding the Western services a steady stream of material that appeared significant but was either fabricated or already outdated. The tunnel was eventually discovered in April 1956. The Soviets staged the discovery to appear accidental, citing routine maintenance work on the cables. Blake continued to operate as a Soviet asset for several more years before being exposed through a separate channel. The tunnel illustrates something that recurs throughout the history of Cold War intelligence programs. The systems designed to generate certainty about the adversary's intentions and capabilities were themselves subject to manipulation by the adversary. Every program designed to reduce uncertainty introduced new forms of uncertainty. Every countermeasure generated a countermeasure. The information that reached decision-makers had passed through so many filters, so many competing institutional interests, so many deliberate distortions, that its relationship to operational reality was often impossible to assess. In the same years that the Berlin Tunnel was being excavated, a parallel effort was underway at a much higher altitude. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft program began as a technical response to a specific problem. American strategic planners needed to know the locations of Soviet airfields, missile launch sites, and nuclear weapons storage facilities. Without that knowledge, the targeting plans for American nuclear forces were operating on assumptions that might be entirely wrong. The U-2 was designed to fly at altitudes that Soviet interceptor aircraft could not reach, and that, at the time of the program's inception, Soviet surface-to-air missile systems could not effectively engage. The aircraft flew above 70,000 feet. Its cameras could resolve objects on the ground small enough to be individually significant. Flights were routed across the most sensitive areas of Soviet territory, including the facilities surrounding the closed cities where nuclear weapons were assembled and stored. The Soviets tracked every flight. Their radar systems could detect the aircraft even at those altitudes. What they could not do initially was reach it. But they knew it was there, knew its approximate route, and knew that an American aircraft was conducting systematic photographic reconnaissance of their most classified installations. This created a situation in which both governments possessed knowledge that neither could officially acknowledge. The Americans knew the Soviets were tracking the flights. The Soviets knew the Americans knew they were being tracked. Both governments maintained public positions that the flights were not occurring. American officials characterized the U-2 as a weather research aircraft operated by a civilian agency. Soviet officials chose, for reasons related to their own domestic political situation, not to publicize their inability to stop the overflights. This arrangement collapsed in May 1960 when an improved Soviet surface-to-air missile system succeeded in shooting down a U-2 over Sverdlovsk. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, survived. The wreckage was recovered largely intact. The Eisenhower administration initially maintained the cover story about weather research, not knowing that the pilot had survived and that the Soviets had physical possession of the aircraft and its photographic equipment. When the Soviets publicly revealed the pilot's survival and displayed the wreckage, the cover story became untenable. Eisenhower acknowledged the flight but argued that such reconnaissance was a legitimate response to Soviet secrecy. The summit meeting that had been scheduled between Eisenhower and Khrushchev collapsed. The period of relative diplomatic engagement that had been developing over the previous 2 years ended abruptly. What the public account of the U-2 incident typically omits is the extent to which both governments had been operating on the shared knowledge of the deception for years before it collapsed. The functional arrangement that had existed, in which the flights continued precisely because the Soviets lacked the capability to stop them, was not a failure of deception. It was something closer to a mutual accommodation. Both governments had an interest in maintaining the fiction, and both governments understood that the fiction served specific purposes. The moment the Soviets acquired the capability to end the arrangement unilaterally, they did so, and the diplomatic architecture built around the fiction collapsed with it. The problem of surveillance from space produced an entirely separate set of programs that operated under even more stringent secrecy requirements. The Corona satellite reconnaissance program was initiated in 1958 and achieved its first successful film return in August 1960, the same year as the U-2 incident. The technical approach was baroque by later standards. The satellite carried film canisters that were physically ejected from the spacecraft and returned to Earth in re-entry vehicles. The re-entry vehicles were caught in mid-air by specially equipped aircraft flying over the Pacific Ocean. If the aircraft missed the catch, the re-entry vehicle was designed to float for a limited period before sinking, taking the film with it. The program suffered 13 consecutive failures before producing its first usable imagery. When it did work, a single Corona mission could photograph more Soviet territory than all previous U-2 flights combined. The existence of the Corona program was not officially acknowledged by the United States government until 1995. For more than 3 decades, the program's very existence was classified above the level of most government officials with security clearances. The president knew. The relevant cabinet secretaries knew. The small group of officials and contractors directly involved in the program knew. Below that level, the photography produced by Corona satellites was distributed to intelligence analysts and military planners through cover stories about its origin. Analysts who received the imagery were told it came from sources they were not to inquire about further. The distribution system was designed so that the product of the program could be used throughout the intelligence community, without the source being identifiable from the product itself. The discipline required to maintain that level of compartmentalization across decades, across multiple administrations, across thousands of individuals who knew portions of the program's existence, represents an institutional achievement that is rarely acknowledged in public assessments of government secrecy. The program worked in part because the people involved understood what was at stake if it became known. Satellite reconnaissance was the technological foundation of arms control verification. Without the ability to monitor Soviet missile deployments from space, the arms control negotiations that eventually produced binding treaties would have been impossible. The secrecy protected the program. The program made arms control possible. The arms control agreements were publicly celebrated as achievements of open diplomacy. The satellite program that made them verifiable remained classified. Nuclear weapons programs occupied a different category of secrecy. The physical scale of what was being built made some aspects of the programs impossible to conceal entirely, but the details of what was being built, where the weapons were deployed, what the operational plan specified, remained within the narrowest possible circles of authorized knowledge. And within those circles, decisions were made that the public institutions of democratic government were never permitted to review or constrain. Project 112 was one of those decisions. Beginning in the early 1960s, the United States military conducted an extensive series of tests designed to evaluate the vulnerability of American forces and territory to biological and chemical weapons attacks. The tests were not conducted in laboratory environments. They were conducted on American soil, in American cities, on American military personnel, and on civilian populations who were not informed that they were subjects of a military research program. The full scope of Project 112 and its companion program, Project Shad, was not publicly revealed until congressional inquiries forced a partial disclosure beginning in 2000. Veterans who had participated in the tests, many of whom had experienced health problems they attributed to their exposure, had been told for decades that no such tests had occurred, or that the materials used had been harmless simulants. The tests that used simulants rather than actual biological or chemical agents were themselves not without consequence. Some of the simulants used were later found to cause health problems in exposed populations. The logic behind using American cities as test environments was straightforward from a military planning perspective. Military planners needed to understand how a biological or chemical agent would actually behave when released in an urban environment, how it would disperse through building ventilation systems, how weather conditions would affect its spread, what the effective coverage area would be under realistic conditions. Laboratory models and open field tests could not answer those questions. Only tests conducted in the actual environments of interest could produce operationally relevant data. San Francisco was subjected to a large-scale simulant release in 1950. A Navy vessel operating offshore released a bacterial aerosol containing Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii. The cloud drifted inland and covered much of the city. Within days, 11 people were admitted to a local hospital with Serratia marcescens infections, a bacterium previously rarely seen as a cause of serious illness in the general population. One patient died. The incident was not investigated as a possible consequence of the military test. The connection between the test and the infections was not publicly established for decades. When it was established, the military's position was that Serratia marquescens was believed at the time to be harmless to healthy individuals and that the deaths and illnesses could not be definitively attributed to the test. Project 112 continued for approximately a decade. The full list of tests, the complete roster of personnel who were exposed, and the comprehensive health data on those personnel have never been fully declassified. What has been released through congressional pressure and Freedom of Information Act requests represents a fraction of the documented record. The fraction that has been released is sufficient to establish that the program operated with complete disregard for the informed consent of the people subjected to it, and with systematic institutional effort to conceal its existence from those people for the remainder of their lives. Project Artichoke and its successor programs within the Central Intelligence Agency represent a parallel track of research into human vulnerability and the potential for controlling human behavior through chemical, biological, and psychological means. The programs began in the late 1940s and expanded significantly through the 1950s and into the 1960s. They were motivated by a specific fear that had been generated by the behavior of American prisoners during the Korean War, some of whom appeared to have been psychologically manipulated by their captors to make false confessions and statements inconsistent with their known beliefs and loyalties. The CIA's institutional response to this perceived threat was to develop comparable capabilities and to understand the mechanisms by which such manipulation was achieved. The research program that eventually became known as MKUltra encompassed more than 150 sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and intelligence service facilities across the United States and Canada. Research subjects included prison inmates, patients in psychiatric facilities, military personnel, and civilians who were given substances including LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, amphetamines, and various combinations of these materials, often without their knowledge or consent. Some subjects were subjected to extended periods of sensory deprivation. Electroconvulsive therapy, applied at intensities far beyond accepted therapeutic parameters, and techniques involving hypnosis and psychological conditioning. The program was formally terminated in 1973. In the same year, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. A significant volume of documents survived the destruction order because they had been misfiled in a financial records annex that was not identified in the initial destruction sweep. Those documents formed the basis of the Senate investigation that produced the Church Committee report in 1975 and 1976, which provided the first detailed public accounting of the program's scope. Even with those documents, the record of MKUltra remains substantially incomplete. What was destroyed cannot be reconstructed. The people who conducted the research and who are still living have provided limited and in some cases contradictory accounts of what occurred. The research subjects who survived and who were informed of their participation years or decades after the fact have had no meaningful recourse. What made these programs possible was not the absence of legal or ethical constraints, but the existence of institutional structures designed to operate outside those constraints. The classification system created spaces in which actions that could not survive public scrutiny could be authorized, funded, conducted, and documented with complete bureaucratic thoroughness, and then either sealed permanently or destroyed. The people who conducted these programs were not operating outside their institutional authority. In many cases, they had explicit written authorization from the highest levels of the organizations they served. They were following procedures. They were complying with directives. The machinery of official secrecy did not protect secrets from the public on behalf of the public's safety. It protected decisions from the public on behalf of the institutions that made them. The strategic nuclear forces that formed the core of the Cold War's deterrence architecture were subject to a similar institutional logic. The fundamental premise of deterrence was that the threat of nuclear retaliation had to be credible. For the threat to be credible, the adversary had to believe that an American president would actually authorize the use of nuclear weapons in response to a Soviet attack. For that belief to be sustained, there had to be genuine doubt in Soviet planners' minds about what the American response would be. That genuine doubt could only be maintained if there was genuine uncertainty about what the American response would be. This logic produced a set of delegation arrangements that effectively distributed the authority to use nuclear weapons below the presidential level. The arrangements were developed in stages and were never fully disclosed to the public or to Congress. Under the system as it existed during the 1950s and into the early 1960s, military commanders at various levels of the chain of command had been given pre-delegated authority to use nuclear weapons under certain defined circumstances, primarily in the event that communications with the National Command Authority were interrupted by a Soviet attack. The definition of what constituted an interruption sufficient to trigger the pre-delegation authority was left to the judgment of the commanders in the field. The implications of this system were significant. A nuclear war could have been initiated not by a presidential decision, but by a military commander's judgment that communications had been sufficiently disrupted to make waiting for presidential authorization futile or impossible. The procedures that were supposed to govern the use of this authority were formalized in documents that were themselves classified above the level of most government officials. The existence of the pre-delegation arrangements was not acknowledged publicly until decades after the relevant presidential administrations had ended. The Eisenhower administration authorized pre-delegation. The Kennedy administration reviewed it and made modifications, but did not eliminate it. The Johnson administration continued with modifications. The arrangements persisted in various forms well into the nuclear age. The specific technical systems built to support this authority structure were equally remarkable. The permissive action link, the electronic lock that prevented unauthorized use of a nuclear weapon, was introduced during the Kennedy administration in response to concerns about exactly the kind of unauthorized or accidental use that the pre-delegation arrangements had created a risk of. The PAL system was designed to require the entry of a specific code before a weapon could be armed. The logic was straightforward. The implementation was not. For a significant period during the Cold War, the PAL codes on American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe were set to a default value of 8 zeros. The combination 000. This was not a security failure in the ordinary sense. It was a deliberate policy decision made by military commanders who believed that the time required to receive and enter an actual code from a command authority in a crisis might be the difference between having a usable weapon and not having one. The formal security requirement existed. The formal security requirement was systematically circumvented by the operational commands responsible for maintaining the weapons. The people responsible for setting the codes set them to a value that rendered the security system inoperative because the security system was perceived as an operational impediment. This situation was documented in a report by the Sandia National Laboratories in 1977, which reviewed the security arrangements for nuclear weapons in the American arsenal and found that the stated procedures and the actual procedures bore a limited relationship to each other. The report's findings were classified. A version of the information became publicly known only decades later through the research of nuclear security historian Eric Schlosser and others who had pursued the documentary record through declassification requests. The delivery systems built to carry nuclear weapons were themselves sources of risk that the official narrative of nuclear deterrence never addressed directly. The B-52 fleet maintained continuous airborne alert from 1960 through 1968 under an operation called Chrome Dome. At any given time during those years, multiple nuclear-armed bombers were airborne over the continental United States and over the approaches to Soviet territory, ready to proceed to their targets within minutes of receiving an execute order. The airborne alert was considered essential to deterrence because it meant that a Soviet first strike could not destroy the entire American bomber force on the ground. But maintaining continuous airborne operations with nuclear weapons over a period of 8 years, with human pilots subject to fatigue, with mechanical systems subject to failure, with weather conditions and navigational errors a constant operational reality, produced incidents that the official record of the period did not acknowledge. On January 17, 1966, a B-52G on a Chrome Dome mission collided with a KC-135 tanker aircraft during a refueling operation over the coast of Spain near the town of Palomares. The collision destroyed both aircraft. 4 hydrogen bombs were released from the B-52 during the breakup of the aircraft. 3 of the 4 bombs landed on Spanish territory. 2 of those 3 released the high explosive component that surrounds the nuclear core, scattering plutonium across a roughly hectare-scale area near the town. The 4th bomb fell into the Mediterranean Sea and was not recovered for nearly 3 months. None of the 4 weapons produced a nuclear yield. The mechanism by which a nuclear weapon produces its yield requires a precisely coordinated sequence of events that was not triggered in any of the 4 cases. But the plutonium scattered by the 2 conventional explosions contaminated approximately 500 acres of Spanish farmland. The United States government negotiated with the Spanish government for permission to conduct decontamination operations. A significant volume of contaminated soil was collected and transported to a licensed disposal facility in South Carolina. Decades later, residual contamination remained detectable at the site. The Palomares incident was the most publicly visible of the accidents involving nuclear weapons during the Cold War, primarily because it occurred in a foreign country and could not be entirely suppressed. The full record of accidents involving nuclear weapons on American soil and over American territory during the same period remained classified for much longer. A 2013 paper by nuclear historian Eric Schlosser, drawing on declassified documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, identified dozens of accidents involving American nuclear weapons between 1950 and 1980, including at least 2 incidents in which a nuclear weapon very nearly produced a nuclear yield through accidental means. One of those incidents occurred on January 24, 1961, 2 days after John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as president. A B-52 on a routine training flight over North Carolina experienced structural failure and broke apart in midair near the town of Goldsboro. The aircraft was carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each with a yield of approximately 4 megatons. 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on one of the weapons failed during the breakup and subsequent fall. The weapon's parachute deployed as designed. The weapon armed itself as it descended. A single low-voltage safety switch remained between the weapon and a nuclear detonation over the American Southeast. That switch held. The weapon impacted a tobacco field and was recovered. The other bomb fell without deploying its parachute and was buried in soft ground at impact. Parts of the second weapon were never recovered. A small plot of land near Goldsboro, North Carolina, contains components of a 4-megaton hydrogen bomb that remain unrecovered and unremovable at depth. The official response to the Goldsboro incident was to classify the details of what had occurred and to provide the public with a statement characterizing the event as an accident involving aircraft that had been carrying nuclear weapons, but with no risk to the public. The statement was accurate in the narrow sense that no nuclear detonation had occurred. It was systematically misleading about the degree to which that outcome had been a near certainty rather than a reliable result of the safety systems designed to prevent it. The Soviet nuclear weapons program operated under different institutional constraints but produced parallel outcomes. The Soviet system was in many respects even more centralized than the American system, with nuclear release authority maintained more firmly at the highest political levels. But the Soviet system also operated under resource constraints, organizational pressures, and institutional cultures that produced their own categories of risk that the official posture of deterrent stability never incorporated. The most significant of the Soviet Cold War programs that reached public knowledge through partial declassification was the perimeter system, known within Russia by the informal name Dead Hand. The system was developed during the 1970s and 1980s in response to a specific concern of Soviet strategic planners. American technological developments, particularly improvements in the accuracy of submarine-launched ballistic missiles and land-based missiles, had raised the possibility that a sufficiently well-coordinated American first strike could destroy a significant portion of Soviet nuclear forces, along with the command and control infrastructure needed to authorize a retaliatory response. If the leadership and the communications systems were destroyed simultaneously with the weapons, the Soviet deterrent would be undermined regardless of the size of the forces that survived. Perimeter was designed to solve this problem by creating an automated system that could detect the indicators of a nuclear attack, determine that the command authority had been destroyed, and issue launch orders to the surviving missile forces without requiring human authorization. The system relied on a network of sensors designed to detect the electromagnetic and seismic signatures of nuclear detonations. It included a separate communication system that operated independently of the normal military command infrastructure. And it included a special class of missiles designed specifically to serve as communication relays, broadcasting launch orders to surviving intercontinental ballistic missiles from airborne platforms that would be beyond the range of incoming warheads. The system required a human decision only to activate it. Once activated, under conditions where the sensors indicated nuclear attacks had occurred and no communications from the National Command Authority were being received, Perimeter could proceed through its assessment and launch sequence without any further human input. The threshold conditions for proceeding to launch authorization were established algorithmically. Whether those conditions accurately reflected the actual threat environment in any given scenario was a question the system had no means of answering that was not already built into its parameters. Perimeter was not a fully autonomous system in the sense that it would activate itself independently. It required human action to enter its operational mode. But once in that mode, the human role had been reduced to a single decision made in advance about whether to trust the system's subsequent judgments. The decision to trust the system had already been made by the officials who activated it. What remained afterward was a machine making consequential assessments about whether it was experiencing the aftermath of a nuclear war. The existence of Perimeter was known to American intelligence services before it was officially acknowledged by any Russian authority. The intelligence on the system's existence contributed to the American side of the arms control negotiations during the 1980s, though the system was never directly addressed in any treaty text because acknowledging it publicly would have required the Soviet government to acknowledge that it had created a system capable of initiating nuclear war through automated processes, which was politically untenable regardless of the strategic rationale. The American equivalent to the concerns that motivated Perimeter was addressed through different institutional mechanisms. The continuity of government programs maintained an elaborate infrastructure of hardened facilities, airborne command posts, and communication systems designed to ensure that at least some fragment of the National Command Authority would survive a Soviet first strike and retain the ability to issue launch orders to surviving American nuclear forces. The specific architecture of those systems, the locations of the hardened facilities, the procedures for transferring presidential authority in the event that the president was killed or incapacitated by an attack, remained classified for decades. The facility, known as Raven Rock, officially the Alternate Joint Communications Center, was constructed in the early 1950s under the mountains near Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, approximately 6 miles from the presidential retreat at Camp David. It was intended to serve as the military's alternate command post in the event that the Pentagon was destroyed or rendered inaccessible. A parallel facility was constructed under Mount Weather in Virginia, intended to serve as the evacuation site for civilian government officials below the level of senior leadership. The hierarchy of who would be evacuated to which facility, in what sequence, under what circumstances, was itself a classified document. These facilities were not secrets in the sense that their existence was entirely unknown. Local residents near the construction sites could see that large-scale underground construction was occurring. Press accounts from the 1950s and 1960s referred to the facilities in general terms, speculating about their purpose. What was not publicly known was their operational capacity, their communication systems, the specific procedures for their activation, and the complete list of personnel authorized to use them. That information remained classified long after the Cold War era in which the facilities had been designed. The psychological dimension of maintaining these programs across decades produced its own consequences that were never measured and never acknowledged. The personnel who staffed the airborne command posts, the missile crews who sat in underground silos for 24-hour alert periods, the analysts who processed the continuous flow of intelligence about Soviet capabilities and intentions, the planners who maintained and updated the targeting databases for nuclear weapons, were all performing work that could be described in purely procedural terms, work that required following established procedures and maintaining operational readiness, but that was in its actual nature preparation for events that could not be domesticated through procedure. The missile crews who maintained alert in the Minuteman silos scattered across the American Midwest were young, largely in their 20s, and were responsible for procedures that would, if executed, contribute to the deaths of tens of millions of people within minutes of the execute order. The training they received was designed to minimize the psychological distance between the requirement and the action. The procedures were drilled until they were reflexive. The purpose was to ensure that the institutional requirement would be fulfilled regardless of what the individual performing it understood about the consequences. The Soviet equivalent to this problem was addressed through similar institutional mechanisms, though the organizational culture and the specific procedures differed. Soviet missile forces operated under tighter central control. The threshold for independent action by local commanders was lower. The procedures for verifying authorization were in some respects more elaborate, and in other respects more dependent on communication systems that were known to be vulnerable to the same attacks the procedures were designed to survive. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is the most widely studied of the Cold War's near-catastrophic moments, and it has been studied precisely because it represents a case where the documentary record, though still incomplete, is extensive enough to reconstruct the sequence of decisions and near-decisions in some detail. What the documentary record reveals, as it has been expanded through the declassification of American, Soviet, and Cuban materials over subsequent decades, is not a story of careful crisis management producing a controlled outcome. It is a story of multiple independent near-catastrophes occurring simultaneously, most of which were unknown to the decision-makers who were supposedly managing the crisis. On October 27, 1962, the day that is generally considered the crisis's most dangerous point, at least 4 separate incidents occurred that, had any one of them developed differently, might have produced outcomes that the decision-makers in Washington and Moscow were not prepared to prevent. An American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia due to a navigational error. Soviet interceptors scrambled to engage it. American F-102 fighters scrambled to escort it back. The F-102s were armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, the Falcon missile, because they had no conventional air-to-air armament. An engagement between American and Soviet aircraft over Soviet territory, in which the Americans might have used nuclear weapons against Soviet interceptors, was a serious possibility for a period of approximately 2 hours before the U-2 safely exited Soviet airspace. Simultaneously, a Soviet submarine operating in the Caribbean, the B-59, had been subjected to an extended period of depth charge attack by American naval forces. The American forces were using practice depth charges to signal the submarine to surface, in accordance with a procedure that had been communicated to Soviet authorities through diplomatic channels. The communication had not reached the B-59's commander, Valentin Savitsky. The submarine had been underwater for an extended period and was running low on battery power and atmospheric oxygen. Communications with Moscow had been intermittent and were currently unavailable. Savitsky concluded that the depth charges represented the opening of a naval engagement that might be occurring in the context of an already begun war. He ordered the submarine's nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. The B-59 carried 1 nuclear-armed torpedo with a yield estimated at approximately 15 kilotons. Soviet submarine procedure required the agreement of both the commanding officer and the political officer before a nuclear weapon could be used. Both officers agreed. What prevented the torpedo from being launched was the presence of a third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who was the flotilla commander traveling aboard the B-59 and who, under a separate procedural requirement applicable to his rank, also had to agree before the torpedo could be used. Arkhipov refused. He argued for surfacing and re-establishing communication with Moscow. After a heated discussion among the officers, Savitsky agreed to surface. Arkhipov's intervention was not known to American decision-makers at the time. It was not known to the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council that Kennedy had assembled to manage the crisis. The incident was reported to Soviet authorities when the submarine reached a Soviet port, but it was classified as an internal military matter and was not shared with American counterparts through any of the post-crisis communications that eventually produced a more complete accounting of what had occurred during the crisis. The full details of what happened aboard the B-59 did not become publicly known until the 40th anniversary conference on the Cuban Missile Crisis in 2002, when Arkhipov's role was disclosed by Russian and American participants who had access to the relevant documents. The third incident on October 27th involved a test launch of a Minuteman missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The launch had been scheduled weeks before the crisis began, as part of a routine testing program. As the crisis intensified, someone noticed that a scheduled missile test was on the calendar. The question arose whether it should be cancelled. The decision made was to proceed with the test, on the grounds that cancelling it might signal weakness or anxiety to Soviet observers. A Minuteman missile was launched from California with full knowledge that Soviet intelligence was monitoring American missile activity and would detect the launch signature. The fourth incident involved an American U-2 being shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The U-2 was on a scheduled reconnaissance mission. Its loss required a decision from Kennedy about whether to order immediate retaliatory strikes against the missile battery that had fired. The decision was not to order immediate retaliation, a decision that required Kennedy to override a pre-existing military authorization he had granted for precisely this contingency. The pre-existing authorization had specified that if an American aircraft was shot down over Cuba, retaliatory strikes would be authorized. Kennedy overrode that authorization in the moment. The crisis was resolved not through any single decisive negotiation or heroic act of statesmanship, but through a combination of private communications, tacit signals, and arrangements that could not be publicly acknowledged at the time. The agreement that resolved the standoff included an American commitment to remove its Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles from Turkey and Italy, a commitment that the Kennedy administration could not acknowledge publicly because it would have appeared to represent a concession to Soviet pressure that might encourage future coercive behavior. The commitment was conveyed through a private communication between Robert Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and was not officially acknowledged for more than 20 years. The period immediately following the Cuban Missile Crisis saw the introduction of new communication arrangements designed to reduce the risk that future crises would be managed through the kind of ambiguous signals and delayed communications that had characterized October 1962. The direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin, which became known as the Hotline, was established in 1963. It was not, as popular culture has consistently portrayed it, a red telephone. It was initially a teletype circuit, chosen specifically because teletype was less susceptible to the kind of misunderstanding and ambiguity that voice communication could produce. The messages transmitted over the circuit were formal, deliberate, and subject to translation review before transmission. The image of a president picking up a red telephone for direct voice communication with a Soviet counterpart was a fiction that both governments found useful to allow to persist because it implied a level of immediate personal control over events that was reassuring to publics on both sides, without requiring either government to disclose the actual nature of the system. The intelligence programs that ran parallel to the operational military programs were generating their own categories of risk during this same period. One of the more consequential of these was the human intelligence program that the CIA ran against Soviet intelligence services and the corresponding Soviet program against American services. Both programs were ultimately more successful at penetrating each other than either government found acceptable to acknowledge. Aldrich Ames, a career CIA officer who began providing intelligence to the Soviet KGB in 1985, compromised the identities of dozens of Soviet officials who had been recruited as CIA assets. Most of them were executed. The damage to the CIA's human intelligence network against the Soviet Union was catastrophic and took years to assess. Ames was not identified until 1994, 9 years after he began his activity, despite numerous indicators that should have triggered a security review. The institutional factors that allowed him to operate undetected for that period included organizational culture that discouraged aggressive internal scrutiny of senior officers, financial controls that were inadequate to detect the pattern of spending that Ames's Soviet payments had enabled, and a classification system that made it difficult for different parts of the organization to correlate the information they individually possessed. The Soviet equivalent to the Ames damage was the penetration of Soviet military and intelligence services by American assets during the same period, the most significant of whom was Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer who provided Western intelligence services with an extraordinary volume of material about Soviet strategic capabilities and intentions during the early 1960s. Penkovsky's material directly informed the American response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, contributing to the assessment that Soviet missiles in Cuba were not yet operational at the crisis's most critical moments and providing detailed technical information about the characteristics of those missiles. Penkovsky was arrested in 1962, tried, and executed in 1963. The reciprocal nature of these penetrations meant that both governments were operating throughout the Cold War with intelligence services that were compromised to degrees they could not fully measure. The information flowing through intelligence channels was of uncertain reliability precisely because the channels themselves could not be trusted. The decisions made on the basis of that information were therefore based on assessments whose uncertainty was itself uncertain. The institutional response to this fundamental problem was to classify it rather than address it, to maintain the formal architecture of intelligence production while managing internally the knowledge that the architecture was compromised. The technical intelligence programs developed by both sides in the 1970s and 1980s represented an attempt to reduce reliance on human sources whose reliability was inherently questionable. The American investment in signals intelligence capabilities, the ability to intercept and process electronic communications, radar emissions, and other electromagnetic signals, expanded dramatically during this period. The National Security Agency, which managed the American signals intelligence effort, grew to become one of the largest employers in the state of Maryland and consumed a significant fraction of the total American intelligence budget. The specific capabilities it developed, the systems it built to process the volume of signals it was collecting, the analytical methods it applied to the raw data it produced, remained classified to a degree that exceeded even the nuclear weapons programs in terms of the narrowness of the authorized knowledge. One specific program that has become partially known through the combination of official disclosures and unauthorized releases is the operation that involved the tapping of Soviet undersea communication cables. Operation Ivy Bells was a collaboration between the NSA and the Navy that involved deploying specialized submersible vehicles to locate and physically access Soviet military communication cables running along the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk. Recording devices were attached to the cables. The devices were periodically retrieved by Navy divers operating from nuclear-powered submarines, and the recorded communications were transported back to NSA facilities for processing and analysis. The operation produced intelligence of exceptional quality for approximately a decade before it was compromised. The compromise came not from Soviet detection of the physical devices, but from a former NSA employee named Ronald Pelton, who sold information about the program to the Soviet KGB in 1980. Soviet intelligence located and removed the recording devices in 1981. The program's existence was officially acknowledged in a limited way during Pelton's espionage trial in 1986, when the government was forced to acknowledge enough of the program's existence to support the prosecution while arguing strenuously for restrictions on the disclosure of any operational details. The specific technical capabilities demonstrated by Ivy Bells, the ability to place and maintain physical surveillance devices in extremely hostile environments at depth and to operate them for extended periods without detection, were themselves a significant intelligence product, though not one that the program's designers had intended to produce. The demonstration that this was technically feasible informed Soviet defensive planning in ways that required the investment of significant resources in cable protection and alternative communication routing. The program's compromise through a human intelligence failure rather than through any technical detection was consistent with the broader pattern throughout the Cold War of technical programs being defeated through the vulnerabilities of the human beings who operated them. The period from the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s saw a significant escalation in the intelligence and military programs of both sides that has subsequently been characterized in various ways depending on the political perspective of the characterizing institution. From one perspective, the escalation reflected a realistic assessment of Soviet military buildup and required a proportionate response. From another perspective, the escalation reflected institutional dynamics within the military and intelligence services of both sides that were largely self-sustaining, generating threat assessments that justified their own expansion. The intelligence estimate known as Team B was produced in 1976 as an explicit challenge to the CIA's existing assessments of Soviet strategic intentions and capabilities. A group of outside analysts, given access to the same raw intelligence data that the CIA's internal analysts used, was asked to produce an alternative assessment. The Team B report argued that the CIA's existing estimates had systematically understated Soviet military capabilities and Soviet strategic ambitions, and that Soviet strategic doctrine was oriented not toward mutual deterrence, but toward fighting and winning a nuclear war. The Team B report was itself subsequently assessed as methodologically flawed, as having applied a selection bias in its interpretation of ambiguous evidence and as having made assumptions about Soviet intentions that were not warranted by the available evidence. But it had an institutional effect that outlasted the specific debate about its accuracy. It established within the American defense and intelligence community a set of assumptions about Soviet intentions that influenced force planning and budget decisions for years. It contributed to the political environment in which the defense budget expansions of the early Reagan administration became possible, and it produced an escalation in Soviet concerns about American intentions that contributed directly to one of the most dangerous episodes of the entire Cold War. Operation Ryan was a Soviet intelligence program established in 1981 to monitor indicators of American preparations for a nuclear first strike. The program was initiated in direct response to the changes in American rhetoric and military posture that came with the Reagan administration. Soviet leadership, including the elderly and in some cases cognitively impaired members of the Politburo who were making strategic assessments during this period, had developed a genuine belief that the United States might be preparing to attempt a disarming first strike against Soviet nuclear forces. The indicators that Ryan was designed to monitor included things like the activity levels at American blood banks, the pattern of lights in government office buildings at night, the movement of senior American officials, and the operational tempo of American military exercises. The rationale for monitoring blood bank activity was that the American government would need to ensure adequate blood supplies for casualty treatment before initiating a nuclear exchange. The rationale for monitoring office building lights was that accelerated government activity in preparation for war would require officials to work through the night. These were not entirely implausible indicators of mobilization activity, but they were also entirely ambiguous indicators, potentially reflecting nothing more than seasonal variation or the particular policy priorities of the current administration. The Ryan program put Soviet intelligence officers in an impossible analytical position. They were tasked with monitoring indicators that were genuinely ambiguous, reporting to leadership that was predisposed to interpret ambiguous evidence in the direction of the worst-case assessment, in an institutional culture that punished analytical conclusions that contradicted leadership expectations. The result was a systematic tendency toward over-reporting the significance of the indicators being monitored. This tendency was operating at its most dangerous level in November 1983, when NATO conducted a major command and staff exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to practice the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear operations in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. It included the actual movement of headquarters communications from routine to wartime procedures, the use of encrypted communications formats that were different from those used in routine peacetime operations, and the involvement of political leaders from NATO member governments in a way that exceeded previous exercises. Soviet intelligence watching the exercise through Ryan's indicators saw something that, through the framework they had been given to interpret it, looked exactly like the final preparatory phase of a nuclear strike. They reported this assessment up the chain of command. Soviet nuclear forces were put on an elevated alert status. Aircraft at some Soviet bases were reportedly loaded with nuclear weapons and placed on the runway in preparation for launch. What prevented the situation from escalating further is not entirely clear from the available record. The exercise ended as scheduled. American intelligence obtained information about the Soviet reaction through sources that included Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who was simultaneously working as a British intelligence agent and who reported the Soviet alert to his British handlers. The information was passed to American officials. The Reagan administration's response was to reduce the provocativeness of subsequent military exercises and to reconsider some elements of its public rhetoric about the Soviet Union. Neither government publicly acknowledged what had occurred. The alert was stood down. The exercise became a data point in the classified record of Cold War near misses rather than a publicly acknowledged crisis. The 1983 period also produced a separate incident that has since become one of the most discussed of the Cold War's nuclear close calls. On September 26, 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite system registered the launch of 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The duty officer at the Soviet Early Warning Center was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. The system showed incoming missiles. Protocol required Petrov to report the launch to his superiors, who would then initiate the response procedures. Petrov did not make the report. He assessed the reading as a false alarm. His reasoning was partly intuitive and partly analytical. The American targeting strategy, as Petrov understood it, would not involve launching 5 missiles. A genuine American first strike would involve hundreds or thousands of missiles launched simultaneously to ensure the destruction of Soviet retaliatory forces before they could be used. 5 missiles was inconsistent with that doctrine. Additionally, the satellite system was new, had known technical issues, and this was its first operational detection of a missile launch. Petrov's judgment was that the probability of a false alarm was higher than the probability of an actual launch under those specific conditions. Petrov was correct. The system had misidentified sunlight reflecting off clouds as the heat signature of missile launches. But the correctness of his judgment was not the point. The point was that a decision with consequences of that magnitude, a decision that, had it gone differently, would have triggered a series of responses that might have ended in the use of nuclear weapons, was made in approximately 20 minutes by a single officer sitting in front of a display system that was showing him information he had no reliable means of verifying. Petrov was neither rewarded for his decision nor formally punished for it. He was questioned by his superiors. He received a verbal reprimand for a procedural irregularity in his logging of the incident. He was subsequently transferred to a less sensitive position. The incident was classified. Petrov retired from the Soviet military and spent years afterward in obscurity. His role in the events of September 26, 1983, became publicly known only in 1998, when a former Soviet colonel published a memoir in which the incident was described. The systems that had produced the false alarm, the early warning satellites, the ground-based radar networks, the communication links connecting the sensors to the decision-makers, were the technical foundation of the deterrence architecture. They were supposed to provide reliable warning of attack, enabling a response before the attacking weapons arrived. But the reliability of those systems was never absolute. The physical and electromagnetic environment in which they operated produced false signals. The software and hardware that processed those signals contained errors. The human beings who interpreted the outputs were working under time pressure with incomplete information in institutional contexts that had their own biases and failures. The targeting plans that governed how nuclear weapons would actually be used, if used, were a product of the same institutional processes that produced everything else in the Cold War's military apparatus. The single integrated operational plan, which served as the master targeting document for American nuclear forces, was developed starting in the late 1950s and was updated regularly through the Cold War. The plan specified which targets would be struck by which weapons, in what sequence, and with what expected effects. It was designed to ensure that the American nuclear response to a Soviet attack, or the American first strike in the event that one was authorized, would be coordinated across all delivery systems and service branches. The PSYOP, as it was known, was a document of such extreme classification that for most of the Cold War, only a small number of officials were permitted to see its full contents. The president was briefed on the plan, but was not given detailed access to the targeting specifications. The specific number of weapons assigned to specific target categories, the expected civilian casualties from the planned strikes, the geographic scope of the destruction that the plan would produce, were not fully available to the elected officials nominally responsible for decisions about nuclear weapons employment. What limited information has become available through declassification and through the accounts of officials who were given access to the PSYOP suggests that the plan, particularly in its earlier iterations, allocated nuclear weapons to targets on a scale that vastly exceeded any operationally meaningful requirement. A study conducted in the late 1950s by the Rand Corporation analyst Daniel Ellsberg, who had been given access to the PSYOP as part of his work on nuclear strategy, estimated that the plan's execution would produce approximately 600 million deaths. The allocation of weapons was driven by targeting logic internal to the military services, rather than by any civilian assessment of what level of destruction would achieve the stated strategic objectives. The result was a plan that could produce catastrophic global consequences for reasons that were procedural rather than strategic. The history of the nuclear weapons programs is in part a history of the failure to translate deterrence theory into operational reality. The theorists who developed the intellectual framework for deterrence in the late 1940s and 1950s were working with an abstract model of how nuclear weapons would affect strategic behavior. The military organizations that implemented nuclear forces were working with institutional cultures, budget processes, inter-service rivalries, and organizational incentives that had very little to do with the theoretical model. The result was a nuclear force whose operational characteristics were shaped more by the internal dynamics of military organizations than by any coherent strategic theory. The arms control process that began in earnest in the 1960s and produced a series of binding treaties was partly an attempt to impose some external constraint on the dynamics that were otherwise driving the nuclear forces of both sides. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 prohibited nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space, primarily for environmental reasons, but with the secondary effect of constraining the pace at which new weapon designs could be developed and tested. The Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 attempted to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to additional states. The SALT agreements of the 1970s placed numerical limits on certain categories of delivery vehicles. The ABM Treaty limited the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems on the grounds that effective defenses would undermine deterrence by making a first strike more attractive. The ABM Treaty was one of the more theoretically sophisticated of the Cold War arms control agreements because it was explicitly based on the counterintuitive proposition that defenses were destabilizing. The argument was that if one side developed effective defenses against ballistic missiles, the other side would respond by building more offensive forces to overwhelm those defenses, or would be tempted to launch a preemptive strike before the defenses became effective. The treaty was therefore an agreement by both sides to remain permanently vulnerable to the other's offensive forces, in the belief that mutual vulnerability was the foundation of stable deterrence. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by President Reagan in March 1983, was a direct challenge to this logic. The proposal to develop space-based defenses capable of intercepting ballistic missiles in flight was presented publicly as a humanitarian vision to make nuclear weapons obsolete. Within the classified deliberations that preceded the announcement, it was understood as a technological gamble whose strategic implications were profoundly uncertain. Soviet reaction to the announcement was immediate and deeply concerned. Soviet military planners assessed the proposal not as a defensive system, but as a potential component of a first strike capability that, combined with American offensive forces, could significantly degrade Soviet retaliatory capacity. The SDI program spent approximately $5 billion per year through the late 1980s before being significantly restructured after the Cold War. The specific technologies it pursued, including the ground-based nuclear-powered X-ray laser that had been proposed by researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, were never demonstrated to work reliably. The electromagnetic railgun research produced results that were useful for understanding the physics of high-velocity projectiles, but not for building a deployable weapon system. The kinetic interceptor research eventually produced systems that achieved limited operational deployment years after the Cold War ended, with capabilities far short of what the SDI program had projected. What SDI accomplished in a strategic sense was to inject into Soviet military planning a profound uncertainty about whether the American technological advantage, if sustained and applied, could eventually degrade the Soviet deterrent to a degree that would undermine the basic condition of mutual vulnerability on which Soviet security was based. This uncertainty contributed to the arms control dynamic that eventually produced the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 and the START negotiations that began before the Cold War ended. The intelligence programs that ran beneath the surface of this diplomatic activity continued to generate incidents and near incidents that were never incorporated into the public record of Cold War history as it was being made. One category of these incidents involved the reconnaissance submarines that both sides operated in each other's territorial waters throughout the Cold War. American nuclear submarines regularly operated in Soviet territorial waters, conducting surveillance of Soviet naval facilities, monitoring the communication patterns of Soviet naval forces, and occasionally trailing Soviet ballistic missile submarines to assess their operational patterns and acoustic signatures. The Soviet response to American submarine surveillance included both active measures to detect and track American submarines and operations of Soviet submarines in American territorial waters. The mutual submarine surveillance activity produced multiple collisions and near collisions between submarines of the two navies, none of which were publicly acknowledged at the time they occurred, and most of which remain in the classified record. A 1992 book by journalists Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew, drawing on interviews with former Navy personnel and partially declassified documents, established that the collisions and near collisions were more numerous and more serious than the official record had suggested, and that the operational tempo of the surveillance activity had been such as to make some degree of physical contact between submarines statistically likely. The institutional response to submarine collisions, when they did occur, was to classify them and to conduct internal reviews of the operational procedures that had led to them. The reviews produced procedural modifications that were themselves classified. The public maintained no awareness that American and Soviet submarines were conducting surveillance operations in each other's territorial waters on a routine basis. let alone that those operations had produced physical incidents. The legal regime governing territorial waters and the law of the sea was simply not applied to these operations. The operations continued because both sides found them strategically valuable, and because neither side found it in its interest to raise the issue formally, which would have required acknowledging the activity. The chemical and biological weapons programs that both sides maintained throughout the Cold War represent another category of activity that the official histories of the period have consistently treated as peripheral to the main narrative of nuclear deterrence. The Soviet Union ratified the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, which prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. By the mid-1970s, a classified Soviet program had begun developing an entirely new category of biological weapons that was explicitly prohibited by the convention. The program, known internally as biopreparat, eventually employed tens of thousands of scientists and technicians at more than 40 facilities across the Soviet Union. It produced weaponized versions of smallpox, plague, anthrax, and a variety of other pathogens, as well as research into entirely novel pathogens created through genetic engineering techniques. The existence of biopreparat became known to Western intelligence services gradually during the late 1980s and early 1990s through defectors and through other intelligence collection methods. The scale of what was eventually disclosed, primarily through the 1992 defection of Kanatjan Alibekov, who served as deputy director of the biopreparat program and published his account in the West under the name Ken Alibek, significantly exceeded what Western intelligence had estimated. The Soviet biological weapons program was not a parallel to the Western programs that had existed and been dismantled after the 1972 convention. It was a program of a fundamentally different scale, designed to produce weapons capable of causing casualties measured in hundreds of millions. The disclosure of biopreparat's scope raised a question that neither the American government nor the Soviet successor states could answer clearly, which was what had happened to the program's stockpiles and to the scientists who had worked on it. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. The Russian Federation that succeeded it inherited both the facilities and the personnel. The international effort to understand the disposition of the biopreparat inventory, to secure the facilities, and to redirect the scientific expertise involved into civilian applications was constrained by Russian sensitivity about the subject and by the limits of American resources committed to the effort. The chemical weapons programs maintained by both sides during the Cold War were also more extensive than the public record suggested. The United States maintained large chemical weapons stockpiles at multiple facilities across the continental United States and at overseas locations through the 1960s. The decision to destroy those stockpiles, announced in 1969 by the Nixon administration, was implemented slowly and incompletely. The disposal process for chemical weapons stored in metal containers that had been degrading for years was technically complex and generated its own environmental hazards. The munitions destroyed in Operation Chase, which involved loading surplus chemical weapons onto ships and sinking them in deep ocean locations, created disposal problems that were not discovered until decades later when fishermen began recovering contaminated equipment from those areas. The Soviet chemical weapons program was not disclosed in comparable terms until after the Cold War. The Novichok agents, a class of chemical weapons developed by Soviet researchers in the 1970s and 1980s, were specifically designed to defeat the protective equipment and medical countermeasures that NATO forces had developed against existing chemical agents. They were developed explicitly to circumvent the Chemical Weapons Convention's verification provisions. Their existence was disclosed publicly for the first time by a former Soviet chemical weapons researcher, Vil Mirzayanov, who published an account of the program in a Russian newspaper in 1992 and was subsequently prosecuted for revealing state secrets. The prosecution was eventually dropped. The space programs of both superpowers were formally presented to the public as civilian scientific endeavors, competitions in the peaceful exploration of space. The reality was considerably more complex. Both programs originated in military research and maintained military applications throughout the Cold War. The rockets that launched astronauts and cosmonauts into orbit were developed from ballistic missiles. The reconnaissance satellites that provided the photographic intelligence essential to arms control verification were developed alongside the civilian space science programs and shared their technical infrastructure. The military dimensions of the space programs were conducted through classified channels that ran parallel to the civilian public programs. The American Anti-Satellite Weapons Program, which developed and tested systems capable of destroying Soviet reconnaissance and communication satellites, was one of the more consequential of these parallel programs. The Partial Test Ban Treaty did not cover space-based weapons that did not require nuclear testing. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibited the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit, but did not prohibit the development of conventional anti-satellite systems. Both sides developed and tested anti-satellite capabilities throughout the Cold War. The systems tested produced debris clouds in low Earth orbit that created hazards for other satellites and that persist as an environmental legacy of the programs that created them. The American program that became known as the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, based on a Soviet concept called FOBS, represented an attempt to use orbital mechanics to circumvent the American Early Warning System. A conventional ballistic missile follows a high trajectory that takes it far outside the atmosphere before returning to Earth. American early warning radars and satellites were oriented to detect this trajectory. A fractional orbital system puts its warhead into a partial orbit that approaches from the opposite direction, a low-altitude trajectory that comes over the South Pole rather than over the North Pole. The existing American early warning infrastructure was oriented northward. A FOBS attack from the south could reach American territory with significantly less warning time. The Soviet FOBS program was tested in the 1960s and maintained an operational deployment for a period. American awareness of the system required both a response in terms of warning system modifications and an assessment of whether the existing arms control agreements covered it. The SALT negotiations produced an agreement that limited fractional orbital systems, but not before the system had been deployed and had operated for years, as a capability that the existing early warning architecture could not reliably detect. The nuclear command and control systems of both sides were tested repeatedly against the actual conditions of the Cold War, and repeatedly those conditions revealed gaps between what the systems were designed to do and what they could actually do. The communication links that were supposed to ensure that launch orders could always be transmitted to nuclear forces, even after absorbing a nuclear strike, were found in realistic exercise conditions to be more vulnerable than the theoretical models suggested. The hardened communication systems were designed to survive nuclear detonations at distances greater than the expected accuracy of Soviet warheads. As Soviet accuracy improved, the survival probability of the communication systems decreased. The American investment in extremely low-frequency radio communications, which could penetrate ocean water to communicate with submerged ballistic missile submarines, was designed to ensure that the submarine force could always receive launch orders. The transmitters that generated the ELF signals were enormous installations covering hundreds of square miles of land in Michigan and Wisconsin. Their existence was not secret, but their specific operational capabilities and the details of how they fitted into the nuclear command and control architecture were classified. They represented a different kind of vulnerability than hardened land-based communications. They were fixed, large, and relatively soft targets that would have been priority Soviet targeting objectives in any nuclear exchange. The communication submarine that served as an airborne relay for submarine launch orders, known as the Takamo aircraft, was another element of the survivable command and control system. Takamo, which stood for Take Charge and Move Out, flew continuous airborne alert missions with very low-frequency trailing wire antennas that could communicate with submarines at depth. The aircraft were also potential targets, and their vulnerability was a recognized limitation of the overall system. Multiple backup communication methods existed, but each had its own vulnerabilities, and the combination of all of them was assessed in classified studies to be less reliable under actual attack conditions than the theoretical reliability of the individual components suggested. The space surveillance systems that both sides maintained to track each other's satellites were themselves a source of strategic uncertainty. The ability to track, characterize, and predict the movement of satellites was essential both for conducting satellite reconnaissance and for conducting anti-satellite operations. The data produced by space surveillance systems was also relevant to ballistic missile defense, since the tracking of re-entry vehicles required similar technical capabilities to the tracking of satellites. The dual-use nature of space surveillance capabilities meant that improvements in the ability to track satellites simultaneously improved the technical foundation for ballistic missile defense, which was itself a strategically sensitive area because of its implications for the stability of deterrence. The civilian nuclear power programs of both sides contributed their own category of risk to the Cold War environment. The accidents at 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986 represented the public face of what the nuclear power programs produced when they failed. What was less publicly known was the extent to which both programs had experienced serious accidents before those two events. Accidents that had been managed through the same mechanisms of classification and controlled disclosure that characterized the military programs. The Soviet nuclear submarine program experienced a series of catastrophic accidents throughout the Cold War that were classified by Soviet authorities and were not fully known to Western governments or publics until after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The K-19 submarine accident in 1961, in which a reactor coolant failure aboard a Soviet Hotel-class nuclear submarine was managed at the cost of severe radiation exposure to the crew, resulted in multiple deaths and long-term health consequences for the survivors. The incident was classified by Soviet authorities and was not publicly acknowledged until decades later. The K-129 submarine that sank in the Pacific in 1968 was subsequently the target of a CIA operation, Project Azorian, which attempted to raise the submarine using a specially constructed recovery vessel disguised as a mining ship. The recovery operation was partially successful. The portions of the submarine that were raised included material of intelligence value. The operation was classified and was not publicly acknowledged until portions of the story leaked to the press in 1975. The K-278 submarine, known as the Komsomolets, sank in the Norwegian Sea in 1989 with nuclear torpedoes aboard. The torpedoes remain at depth. The radioactive materials they contain continue to leak into the surrounding ocean environment in quantities that Russian and Norwegian environmental monitoring agencies have tracked, but that have not required any remediation action beyond continued monitoring. The history of the Cold War, as it is typically presented, is a history of decisions, negotiations, and deployments. It is a history of deterrence maintained, crises managed, and war avoided. This presentation is not wrong in its broad outlines. Nuclear weapons were not used between the superpowers. The Cold War ended without a major military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. These are significant facts. What the conventional presentation omits is the infrastructure of risk that was built and maintained throughout the period, the systems designed to function without human judgment, the accidents that were managed through classification rather than transparency, the near misses that became known only decades later and only partially, the programs that violated domestic and international law with institutional authorization, and the sustained degradation of the human beings who were asked to maintain permanent readiness to participate in events that the theoretical framework of deterrence said would never occur. The Soviet Union formally ceased to exist on December 25, 1991. The Russian Federation that succeeded it inherited the nuclear arsenal, the intelligence services, the military establishment, and the institutional cultures that the Cold War had created. The United States retained its own nuclear arsenal, its own intelligence services, its own military establishment, and its own institutional cultures. The treaties that had been negotiated between the two governments remained in force. The targeting plans that had been developed were modified, but not eliminated. The early warning systems continued to operate. The submarines continued their patrols. The command and control systems remained on alert. The logic of deterrence, the requirement for credible retaliation, the maintenance of forces capable of functioning after absorbing a first strike, did not become unnecessary when the political conflict that had motivated their creation ended. The systems built to fight a war that was never declared outlasted the political conditions that had produced them, and continued to function according to their own institutional requirements, waiting for circumstances that the people who built them had hoped would never arise. The Cold War ended. The systems that sustained it did not.